ISO FileMaker Magazine, the professional's resource for FileMaker know-how.
Well, hello there and welcome to this video. My name is Matt Petrowski, bringing you these FileMaker tutorial videos from my website, FileMakerMagazine.com. I'm so glad that you joined me for this particular video. This is a fun video where we're taking a look at new technology that allows you to get data from external sources into FileMaker using its data API. Now, this is more of an informational video, so don't be scared. Most of what I'm showing you is not exactly how to do everything, but just to be informed about what's available, what's out there in terms of getting data into FileMaker using the data API. Let's take a look at what I'm talking about. All right, to start off, I mentioned in the intro that we're basically not going to cover everything possible in order to learn all of this technology. And that is because it would take me many hours in order to explain from a ground level all of the different things that you would need in order to understand everything about what's going on. We're using multiple different pieces of technology. We're not just in FileMaker, although our end destination is FileMaker. Now let's go through just some of the parts that I am using. I am going to have to use a terminal because I'm going to be running an instance of Node called Node-RED. On top of that, we've got here locally installed FileMaker server. In fact, as I switch over to my web browser, we can see right here that I've got the FileMaker admin console. This is a copy of FileMaker server that's running on my machine. Now, of course, you need FileMaker server because it is what's hosting the data API. You cannot do this with FileMaker peer-to-peer. Node-RED. This is Node module that runs on top of Node. Node.js is a JavaScript and engine that was released by Google and allows us to run all kinds of things using that JavaScript engine. Node-RED was released to be run within Node that allows you to use a really nice visual UI. Now, Node-RED by itself, it really doesn't do anything for us until we get to the point where we scroll down to the very bottom here, and you can see that we've got this area where we've got FileMaker. In Node-RED, we've got all of these different options. For example, the ability to create a record, the ability to run scripts, databases, editing, finding, everything that you are familiar with in FileMaker is here within Node-RED. Now, before I move on from this point, I need to give props to the person who made this possible. A friend of mine, a really good friend of mine, in fact, and somebody who's been contributing to the FileMaker community, Louis de la Parra, he's also known as Louis Dog on GitHub, has essentially made this possible. He's going to be presenting this at DevCon 2019, and he may more than likely be going more in depth than what I'm going to show right here. Now, what I'm showing you is a fundamental example of how I'm going to be using Node-RED. But before I do that, let me explain what my former process was. My former process was in FileMaker server, I was using PHP with a module, not a module, but code released by the folks over at Goya that allowed you to use a REST API via PHP. Now, that was when PHP was really popular. In fact, I meant to check on it, but I haven't yet to see what version of PHP FileMaker is still shipping with the API that FileMaker provides. And that, I'm guessing that it's going to be going away. And that's because I'm pretty sure that the API is deprecated. I'll put a comment here on the video after researching it. I'm pretty sure that the PHP API is going to be deprecated. And what's going to be favored is the data API. So I'm essentially going to need to move. And if FileMaker is only including a version of PHP such as PHP 5.6, that itself is already deprecated and no longer supported by PHP. So unless FileMaker moved up to PHP 7, PHP and everything you've done with it is sort of going to go away. And that's because you're not going to be getting security releases. All right. So now all of that boring stuff out of the way, let me show you what I'm talking about in terms of what I'm doing. You want to see the actual action. Here I have in front of me is an example order that I get from my online store, from Yahoo. Now, there's multiple ways to receive data on the web. The more common popular method nowadays is using JSON or JavaScript in essence. When you hit an API, which is what is known as an endpoint, which is basically just a URL, as long as you pass the right information and the right type of request, we have gets and we have posts, and as we'll see, a post allows you to push stuff without actually having it within the URL. A get, typically you have values in the URL when you're going to get something, if you're going to make specify pieces of information that you're going to request. These are known as query fragments, I believe, in the URL itself. But the URL is the endpoint. So when you hit an endpoint, you're basically hitting an API. Now that's a different situation than what I have right here. What I have is there is a service that is Yahoo, a Yahoo store that I use, which is where people place orders for the magazine. So as we see right here, we can see that this particular item, as I scroll down here, is all in XML. Now these are the two predominant methods of receiving information from some type of request or something that's automated, which in my case is the Yahoo store. The Yahoo store, each time an order is placed, it then sends this XML information to whatever URL I specify. Formerly, I was using PHP and I was capturing that at a URL on the FileMaker server. Now, when it comes to using Node, Node can be on a completely separate server or it can be on the same FileMaker server. And this really is going to boil down to whether or not your server has the resources in order to support running both Node and FileMaker. If your FileMaker server is heavily used, then of course you want all of the resources of that server to be used for FileMaker, and you can easily spin up another server which is separate from your FileMaker server, but it can still talk to the FileMaker server because you're talking to an endpoint or a URL. So let's see this in action. This is all of the raw XML that I receive. I've got test data in here. This right here is basically for me to test encoding. This is ISO 8859-1 encoded, where these two characters normally would be an umlauted O. And so I'm testing that as at the time that I'm shooting this video and working within the node. So another piece of the puzzle that we need is something that replicates sending this XML to my test server. I can't contact Yahoo and say, Yahoo, can you just send me a bunch of orders over again? Of course, I can log into my Yahoo store, and they do provide a feature where you can typically click a button in order to test and have some items sent to whatever endpoint you want. This is Postman. Postman allows you to replicate or create a whole API. This is a tool that you need to use in order to send information to your node server, which your node server is then going to process that information and push it into the FileMaker data API. So watch what happens. We're watching right here, just below my head, that a record is going to come into this particular FileMaker database. So I'm going to click send right here, which is emulating what the Yahoo store does each time that they receive an order. I click send, and then lo and behold, the value shows up right there. So we've got the numeric time, we've got anything that was in the XML that's right over here. In fact, let's just change a value. I'll change this from a store order to 10,000. Right there. Is that 10,000? That's more than 10,000. And we'll zoom back out, and we will simply send this one. And now we'll see that right there above my head, there is our new order right there, 10,000 as opposed to 1099. So this is really pretty cool stuff. The issue is that you have to learn about all of these different technologies in order to get this to work. One is setting up the node server and running that on the right port and running that within Node and knowing how to update and knowing how to get all of the modules in the right place. Then there's also within Node itself, setting up all of the specifics. How do you connect to your FileMaker database? How do you translate whatever's coming in, whether it's JSON or XML, and how do you make all of that happen? Now, all of these details, these are all the things that would basically take multiple hours for me to explain. In fact, I am considering creating a series talking about all of this from the ground up, maybe a training series where we talk about how you actually do this if you know nothing about running a Node server and setting that up, or running multiple versions of Node and getting things going. But I'm going to give you just a little taste of how this works by walking through my flow here, my process, so that you get an understanding of what's available to you coming up in terms of the technology that you can use in order to get data into FileMaker using the Data API. So let's go through some of the details. Okay, so let's dive into some of the details about how things work. Now what we have in front of us is the Node-RED server. Now Node-RED running on Node is something that you have to install in order to get this to run, but the way that this works is fundamentally it's an input and output system. You're going to receive input and then you're going to receive output. But what you can do with Node-RED is pretty much limitless. It is really cool stuff. It's a visual way to construct logic that normally you would have to program in JavaScript via a text editor. But you get to use these things called nodes. Now, as I stated, Louis has created all of the FileMaker systems that we need in order to communicate with FileMaker, but that's not the only thing you can do with Node. In fact, Node-RED is commonly known and associated with Internet of Things, home alarm systems, sensors, input, output, scales, anything you can think of. In fact, you can even see right here as I zoom in, I've got an Alexa local. You can do things, you'll find these videos on YouTube if you just look for Node-RED, where you can have an Alexa in your local environment and then say, Alexa, turn on or off something, and you connect it up to Node-RED. Now you can't do things like, Alexa, add a record to my database, because that'd be really simple, and the Alexa local doesn't do that, but there are nodes that will allow you to do all kinds of different things. When it comes down to input and output, we have in this situation input that's coming from our Yahoo, and that's posting XML. We also want to be able to test this, and we're going to do that with this node right here called inject, where we're able to simulate a FileMaker record. Now first off, you can see that my server is not currently connected, and that's because Node-RED is not currently running. I wanted to give you a quick little peek about how this works. I happen to be using NVM in order to manage multiple versions of Node. Now, everything that you see me type over here in the command line, and we'll zoom in up here. Actually, let's see if I can get a little bit closer there. There we go. Everything that you see me typing here, this is all going to be dependent on the system where you have installed Node. I am, of course, am running this on my local Macintosh. So let me type in NVM list. These are the versions of Node that I have running, and I am using Node version 11.14.0, and I had to switch to that in order to get Node, or that's where I installed Node. Now again, I'm not going to go through all of the details about how to get Node installed. You can go to the Node-RED webpage and get the information yourself for what you need. But essentially, all I have to do right here is type Node-RED, and that's because the Node-RED modules are installed within Node, I should say. So you can see right here is what happened is we got a bunch of startup information where it tells me welcome to Node-RED, and then right here I've got the server is now running at HTTP, and Node-RED runs off of port 1880. That's the default. You of course can set this to whatever port you want, and you can also protect this with a secure certificate, of course, HTTPS. So Node-RED is now running, and we will see this in the background when we do things such as restart our flows. Now I can't get into everything about the editor, but as I click try now on my Node-RED server, we can see that I'm now connected. And what we're going to have is a situation where we need to add nodes in order to do whatever it is that we want to do. So in my case, I had to do a little bit of digging. You always have to do any type of development requires some reference to documentation. But I'll give you some quick overviews. If you're going to get into Node-RED, or you're going to go to Louis' session at DevCon if you're attending that, or if you watch that after this video, usually FileMaker posts the videos about DevCon. The first thing that you want to know is in order to know whether or not there are problems, you're going to want this type of sequence right here. This input variable called a catch is going to fundamentally catch any problems throughout the whole of your system. In order to see those problems, we're going to have to add this item right here, which as I scroll over to the side is here in output called Debug. Now remember, I said that Node is pretty much an input and output system. Well, that's one of the places where nodes are listed as input and output. But of course, there are many other things, such as the FileMaker nodes. Let's see if, there we go, we've got FileMaker, and upload starts to come when I'm actually filtering here in this. But essentially, you just have to become, like you do with all of the FileMaker functions, familiar with all of the different types of nodes. Now, one of them is this input right here of HTTP. So this is something that I dragged out right here where Yahoo XML is received. Now within the node editor, every one of these things that you drag out here, these nodes, will show you whether or not, or whatever their status is. This means that this flow is currently saved because it does not have blue dots. When it has these little blue dots, then that means that this particular node has been modified or even just moved. If you move it on the grid itself, it'll put a little blue dot because its position has changed. But that doesn't mean that the configuration has changed. But of course, if you did change the configuration, then it would, of course, show the little blue dot. Now, the little triangle or the warning says, well, I don't have all of the information I need in order to be a valid node. So when we look at this, as I select this one and I just hit the delete key, we'll double click and then there is an editor that will open in Node in order to edit this. We can see that here in the settings that I am getting a post which I receive from Yahoo. Remember I mentioned that get? Get is when you're making a request and you can have parameters in that called query fragments. Post is when you're going to send something or receive something, either as input or output. Put, delete, and patch are also other methods that you can use, but we'll save those for another video at another time. Our two predominant methods are get and post. Now this post we are receiving as input. We can also make a post as output to another service, wait for information from that service, and then come back. Remember, you can do anything here within Node by simply wiring up nodes. The difficulty comes in when you need to understand a little bit of JavaScript in order to make things work. So we can see right here that the post that I am receiving is at /Yahoo. Now every node that we put into Node allows us to give it a name. The name really is just here visually for us to be able to see what's going on. For example, this particular node, which is a function node, is going to convert the buffer of the input. Now here's something that I had to learn. When it comes to using Node, everything goes down to a much lower level than what you're used to in terms of FileMaker. In FileMaker, you just deal with the XML as text. But that's not how things work on the network. On the network, things are passed around as bits and bytes, and you get buffers, and you have to process those, and we'll have to save all of that for another video at another time. But essentially, what I have to do is convert the buffer. So I convert the buffer. Once I've converted that buffer, I then have an XML node which converts all of the XML into basically JSON. That in order to use the information here in Node, it's running within JavaScript, within Node, which is JavaScript, and then it wants to use JSON, which is JavaScript. So I convert that, and then we map the fields. Now there's two inputs that I have in this flow. One is the actual input that I'll receive from the post or the simulated post. This is where Postman comes in. Postman allows me to simulate what Yahoo would be sending using all of the exact same data that Yahoo sends me. So whatever you're getting, you want to capture that or look at the definitions for that. Right here in this particular post of the XML, most everything has a definition of what you're going to receive. If you're receiving it from an API that's on the internet, they have documentation, and that documentation says, here's exactly what you're going to get. Here in the XML that I received from Yahoo, this DTD, which I believe, I don't know what the acronym stands for anymore. It's document declaration. I don't know what the T is for. But this DTD defines what I will receive or what I could potentially receive from Yahoo, meaning it's just a listing of all of the different possible values and what their limitations are, meaning how long they can be, etc. I can use that DTD in order to replicate a full XML document, or I can just use one of the XML documents that I capture from Yahoo sending it to me. Yahoo also provides it for me online where I can just click a button and see the XML. So it's always a good idea to go get some of the source and then just populate that with your own test data while you're working. So clicking send obviously does the simulation where it posts in, converts the buffer, XML is used and translated into JavaScript, and then I map the fields. Now, here's one other tip. Again, we're not going through all of the specifics and all of the details in this whole video, but most of Node, let's see, boils down to this thing called message.payload. Now, this whole notion of a payload, that's this glob of stuff that you get, do something to, and then move on through the whole of the sequence. That's essentially what Node boils down to in terms of the input and the output. You get this message.payload, but then within that, you can put all kinds of other things. In fact, you can put things outside of the payload, but most commonly, you're going to see payload as one of the common things. Otherwise, if you put it outside of the payload, instead of message.payload, it becomes something like message.whatever. Or in my case, I move something and put it into message.xml. That's outside of the payload, but conceptually, it's the payload that's pushed along the whole of the chain of the whole flow, and it's modified or manipulated as needed and ultimately ends up being used at the end of the flow. So in this solution, I haven't done a full mapping, but in this case, I'm using JavaScript in order to create a variable called myOrder, and then I'm mapping my fields to the conversion that was done on the XML. So the great thing about Node is that when you're looking at something, let's go ahead and look at, let's say, for example, well, I would have to send a debug. Let's go ahead and turn on one of the debug messages. We'll turn on the message.payload right here. And we will deploy my flows. Now again, remember, I can't tell you everything about Node, but if I make a change in my Node flow, or in my flow in Node, I should say, I must deploy that so that those changes are then affected when I send something. So what I'm going to do is there are some areas here in Node where we get information about a node when we're selected on it, or we can get debug information, that's output that we've chosen to see. Now this little item right here on this output, and this is output because it's on this side of the node as opposed to this side of the node. If it's on this side of the node and we have something sticking out, it's input. If we have something on this side, it's output. This can be turned on or off by clicking it to go in or out. So we'll click that out and we'll click deploy again to make sure it's deployed. So this message payload means that this debug node, this right here, this is a debug node. That debug is going to put whatever is in that chain at whatever point into this particular area. So let's go ahead and click send right here, which will send. The new record will show up over there right behind my head. There it is. And then this payload is going to show me this information. Now what's really cool about Node is that you don't have to do a whole lot of work in order to set up these workflows. That's because over here on the side, when I look at this data, we can see all of the information that was captured. This is my mapping of my fields to the data that was received from the XML. But there's this little button right here which allows you to copy this path. So you may be wondering, in this map fields area where I have all of these different long items, you may be thinking, did I have to type those? I didn't have to type them. I simply, once I injected the XML the first time, I debugged and pushed that into the debug area, and I just simply went through and copied these little items right here, copying them and then mapping them directly to my fields as you see right here. And so it wasn't a really hard process in order to get these done. Once the XML has been parsed, for me, it's just copy, paste, set up my field map. So the next thing we have is what happens when we want to test data. Well, as I mentioned just a little bit earlier, here we have a node with the little widget on the side of input. So this input allows me to use an inject. And again, I can't go through all of the different settings on the node. I'll let you look at other videos on YouTube, and maybe I'll create a series going through all of the different items. But in this instance, I am injecting something. I am making some fake data, then I'm using the create record that we have right here. So as I scroll over and we take a look at more of the node, we can see what's going on. At each point in the process, you can see that I have multiple debug nodes in order to debug different things at different points in time. And of course, as I showed you, you can turn these on or off. Well, at this point, after the XML has been processed, I get to create my FileMaker record. As we all know, things may not always go exactly as planned. You may have problems. So you need to handle your errors in Node here just like you do when you're programming with FileMaker. So this catch that we have right here, as I zoom out and we scroll over, remember one of the very first things I mentioned that we need is a catch-all? As we're setting up this flow, this catch-all will catch any error that happens on any one of these particular nodes. In fact, as I double click, you can see right here that we are catching errors from all nodes. Now it's possible to catch errors only from one specific node or multiple specific nodes. So as we close this panel and I double click here, you can see that in this particular case, I am catching errors from selected nodes, and the only one that I'm catching an error from is the create record. So that means if we have problems, or more properly, if FileMaker has problems, then that error will get caught by this particular node right here. So what happens when we do get an error? Well, typically we want to be notified. So I want to be notified, and I also want to return an error to the API that is sending this information out. Remember, it's Yahoo, all the way over here, that's sending out the XML. But Yahoo also needs a response. It needs to know whether it successfully transmitted that XML or if it failed. Now, if you've worked with the web at all at any point, then you know that most of the time when you ask for a web page and you receive a web page, you get a confirmation code. That confirmation code is success of a HTTP response of 200. If it's a failure, then you get a response of a 404, meaning that page wasn't found. Now, I'm not going to go into the details of how you use the HTTP response codes in order to set up your own API. That's way beyond the scope of this video. But in essence, we need a success or failure situation here, at least as far as Yahoo is concerned. So you can see right here, if I did not create the record or if there were problems that FileMaker had, I catch that error. If I catch that error, then I'm going to do two things. One, I'm going to give Yahoo a response, which we can see this line follows along. It's then using a template, which in this case is just it's just standard HTML, and it returns a response of an HTTP 404. Now, if you notice, this whole flow starts with an input of internet and then an output of internet, because that's the process. We received something, and that something needs a response, or in this case, Yahoo does. Now here you can see that I'm using pushover in the event that there's an error, and this message is basically saying whatever I want to do. This is what's known as a change node, and this one is known as a switch node, and I'm going to have to leave it up to you to become familiar with these nodes. Once you get used to them, they're pretty easy. In this case, I have data coming in, which FileMaker attempts to create the record. It either does or it does not. If it does, it ends up with a record ID. If it does not, then there is no record ID. I have two options. Either I got success or I got a failure. In this case, I'm saying the record ID is greater than 0. Well, I got a record. Otherwise, I'm going to fail. But in many cases, the fail is actually caught by the catch. And that's when, say, for example, somebody changes the name of a layout, or the credentials change and something fails. In that situation, if your information, such as my orders from my Yahoo store, are not being caught and sent into FileMaker, that's pretty critical. So you want to be notified. So I'm using a pushover notification in order to get notified of when that happens. So how do you cause an error? Well, let's go ahead and do that. An error can be caused by any of a number of things within FileMaker. Number one, the credentials could be bad, meaning the credentials that we put into Node for FileMaker could be wrong. Now, where are those set up? Well, let's double click on our create record, and we can see right here that we have a client of a FileMaker DB. Now, there's one type of node that's sort of hidden. It's not shown on the workflow right here that we get to set up, and that's a configuration node. Now, if I click this little button right here, it will take me over into this debug area. It will switch to the listing of nodes, and it'll show you my configuration node. Trust me, it's basically using the same pane right here and allows you to just put in the URL of your database and the connection. Well, let's just go ahead and see it. I'll just click it, and we'll see right here that it opens up, and there we go. We can see in this case, I am hitting my server, which in this case is localhost. I've got my Yahoo orders, the database, I've got the account, and then I have the password right there. And you can set up multiples of these database connections. There's nothing that stops you from connecting to multiple FileMaker servers all over the place, doing all kinds of things to push this data into FileMaker. So we're going to create a problem. The first problem is our security credentials could be wrong or have been changed. Our second problem is the layout, which we see right here on the create record. FileMaker, because of its API and how it works, does require a layout, a target layout where those fields are going to exist. You can see right here that there's that message payload, but in this case, I'm passing it into a further variable within the payload called data. And you can also run a script. This is pretty much full access to the data API. Louis did a stellar job. So if the layout is incorrect, or in this case, if the data was incorrect, I say, for example, in my fields, if I went to order ID and I had the storage set, or excuse me, the validation set, and I had turned on this option right here, unique value, if I chose to send the same order from Yahoo, meaning in my FileMaker database, I only ever want to allow one instance of each order, this would cause an error, and that catch would then catch the problem. Also, if we have the more general error, a developer goes into our system, they bring up the layouts, and for some reason they decide to change the name of the layout. I just put an X on that right there, and we close that. This has now broken this particular workflow, and I want to be notified. So this pushover right here, which uses my credentials, will notify me when this whole workflow fails. So let's go ahead and send that. And I don't know if you heard that, but off screen right there, I just got a little message. So we'll take a look at that. I'll switch into my pushover, and we'll take a look at the item right there. I think I can show that on screen. Yeah, there we go. You can see that that came into my phone and it bypassed any silenced. If my phone is on silence, I can set pushover to go ahead and do the sound anyway because this is critical emergency and let me know right away that this failed in terms of the process. So that was a lot of explaining and hopefully you picking up some details in terms of how this can be used in order to do some really cool things. Now, the great thing about this whole system is, and Node-RED, is that if you didn't know, and this is not any foreknowledge, I have no idea whether this would or could happen, you can always run a Node server separate from FileMaker. But did you know that FileMaker, since server 17, I believe, has been using Node under the hood for the admin console? This is really cool stuff. This means that there is the possibility that if FileMaker opened up their use of their Node server, that maybe they install or let Node-RED ride alongside. Of course, that's still going to always come down to whether or not you technically want to do that, whether you want to split up your work node between a dedicated node server and a FileMaker server, or whether you want to run a separate node server on the same server as a FileMaker server. There's just so many different configurations of what you can and can't do. But just in case you didn't know, I wanted to throw out there that FileMaker has been using Node, and Node-RED is just a module that runs within Node. So the really cool thing about this whole system and setup that we have here is the fact that this very much feels like the relationship graph. It feels like something that we are used to, but this interconnects with so many different things, and it's absolutely fast. A node server can scale infinitely. In fact, a node server is so lightweight that you can run them on extremely cheap little hardware, such as a Raspberry Pi, $35, and basically do all kinds of different things in terms of processing your data. So I hope this has been a good overview. I know it's been a little bit of a long video, but again, it would take me many different videos in order to walk you through each and every step in order to successfully set up a node server using Postman, setting up your nodes and processing data. But this has given you a good idea of what's possible in terms of using the Data API in conjunction with a node server in order to replace something like an older technology, which would be PHP, which I believe is deprecated according to FileMaker's documentation. So, as always, I'd like to wish you much luck with your own FileMaker development, and until next time, happy FileMaking. We hope you've enjoyed this video tutorial, and we'd like to say thank you for your subscription and your support. If you're not already a subscriber, head on over to www.filemakermagazine.com/subscribe for more information about the benefits of joining.